Hello again, everyone. It's so good to have another opportunity to speak to you again from my studio here in Essex. It's really my spare bedroom. Last time I spoke to you about Daniel in the lion's den from chapter 6 of the book of Daniel, and I hope you found it interesting and helpful. Some of you will remember that Daniel had 3 friends called Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and I thought we could look at part of their story today. You'll find it in Daniel chapter 3. The story begins with King Nebuchadnezzar, who was a very religious man. Let's read about him. Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. King Neb was so religious that he wanted everyone to join him in his faith. Now, I hope that you feel the same, that you want many, many people of all different nationalities to join you in our Christian faith. But the king's faith was very different from ours, and his methods were the opposite of ours. We're told that he built a golden statue, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, so 10 times taller than it was wide, like an immense column. Now, because there may be children with you today, I can't describe it to you in detail, but it was a huge, obscene fertility symbol. It was horrible and disgusting. That was bad enough, but then the king made it worse by saying, when the music plays, everyone will bow down and worship the statue. Now, God invites people to worship him. When the music plays at church, you may sing a hymn, if you wish. If anyone makes you worship, it can't be worship, can it? But the king didn't believe in choice, and he made it even worse. When the music played, if you didn't bow down to his hideous statue, you would be thrown into a fiery furnace and burnt alive. Now, if you don't have a strong faith in any religion, in a situation like that, you will bow down to stay alive, won't you? And we're told that when the music played, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the statue. So people of all different religions, whatever they privately believed, bowed down to the idol because they were afraid of the king. But while everyone was down, 3 men stood up. Verse 8. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. you have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. King Nebuchadnezzar had called them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, naming them after his own gods. But their real names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they were much better names. Hananiah means God is gracious. Mishael means who is like God, and Azariah means God has helped. When the king changed their names, he hoped to destroy their identities. But even if you change someone's name, you cannot necessarily change their heart. They would only bow down to their God. That's our God, Jehovah, the one true God. And he said in the 10 Commandments that you shouldn't bow down to any statues. The king's statue was horrible and offensive, but even if it had been a beautiful angel, they still wouldn't have bowed down to it. Now these 3 young men were the king's favourites. He had chosen them from the Jewish exiles, renamed them, and trained them to be his servants. You can read all about it in chapter 1. But that meant that they had made enemies. In verse 8 we read, "At this time some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews." In verse 12 we read what they said. "There are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." As some of you may know already, if you are faithful to God, you may make enemies. These were astrologers who came forward, so they followed a false religion. If you speak the truth about God, it will show up other people's lies, and they won't like it. But there was also overt anti-Semitism here, as they sneered about the Jews. And that's very topical today, sadly. Anyway, the king was furious, but because he had invested so much in them, he gave them one more chance. Verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" When the music played again, they would bow down to the statue or else be thrown immediately into the furnace. No court of appeal. So they'd made their point, they'd satisfied their conscience. Now it was time to be sensible. All they had to do was bend their bodies. And then the king had asked, "What God will be able to rescue you?" And in reply, the 3 friends told him. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made a great statement of faith. They would do what was right, come what may. You will be tempted to compromise your faith to make it easy for yourself. No. Do what is right, and if you are opposed, carry on doing it. Sometimes God will rescue you from the situation. But even if he doesn't, carry on doing what is right. You see, the three friends knew they couldn't lose. Either God would rescue them from the fire, or he wouldn't. If he did, they would be a living testimony to God's grace. If he didn't, they would go straight to heaven, where, according to the book of Revelation, the martyrs are highly honoured. As Paul said, to live is Christ, to die is gain. But now the king was even more angry. He did not agree at all. Verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. In his fury, he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and then he settled down to watch them burn. But idolatry will always end up destroying itself. He counted them in the flames. 1, 2, 3, 4. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisers, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, O king. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. There were 4 men in the fire, and the 4th one, he said, looked like a son of the gods, although the old translation puts it more bluntly. The form of the 4th is like the Son of God, he said. And that's because there is only one God, and he only has one Son. Jesus hadn't saved them from the fire, but he had entered the fire with them. And the sad thing is that the soldiers who threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace were killed by the heat. And they were the king's best soldiers too. If they had done what was right and refused to cooperate, then they would have been thrown into the fire with the 3 friends. And they would have survived instead. In this life, we are not immune from suffering, as many of you know. Often God will answer our prayers and save us from a particular difficulty. But he will never save us from all difficulties this side of heaven. And that's because our faith must be tested. But a faith tested can be trusted. And remember, he is always with us, wherever we are and whatever we have to face. Recently, I told my friends in Myanmar this story on Zoom. Persecution is very fierce in Myanmar, so it is a very pertinent story for them. But you too must decide whether you will stand up for Jesus or bow down to political correctness. Anyway, they were greatly encouraged as the Zoom call ended. But then, to my horror, I realised that I'd left the 3 friends in the fire, and I had to pick up the story the next month. So we can't finish here. Let's read what happened next, verse 26. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisers crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be burned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So the king called them out of the fire, and they stood before him. Did you notice what they said? Nothing at all. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, we read that there is a time to be silent and a time to speak. It is right that we tell people about Jesus, just as he commanded us, but that doesn't mean that we tell everyone all the time. Because we can't speak to everyone all at once, we need wisdom to discern whom we should speak to, when we should speak to them, and what we should say. Only the Holy Spirit can give that wisdom. So we should ask him. This is not an excuse to always be silent. The 3 friends were in the fire precisely because they had spoken to the king and told him they would not worship his statue. They even said that they were willing to suffer for their defiance. So, be bold when you speak about Jesus, and wise when you are silent. But sometimes you don't need to speak. God had done something great, and the friends didn't need to say anything. In fact, the king spoke for them. He said 4 things. 1, he called them servants of the Most High God. God had revealed himself to the king through the faithful suffering of his servants. Sometimes you may cry out to God, "Why must I suffer so much?" The reply may be that God is bringing others to faith through your faithful witness. 2, he said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." Their faithfulness brought praise from the king's lips. It may well be that one day, because of your faithful witness and perseverance, some of those who currently mock you will be worshipping alongside you. Pray for them. 3, he said in verse 28, that the friends had trusted in God and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. The only weapons we Christians have are prayer and loving self-sacrifice. But those weapons are more powerful than the evil around us. The king recognized the source of their power. And 4, the king said, "No other God can save in this way." The king spoke the truth for the three friends so that they didn't have to say anything. I pray many things for those who are persecuted, but one thing I always pray is that they will find unexpected allies to help them. Remember, Jesus said, "Whoever is not against us is for us." And please note, when the king called, they came out of the fire and stood silently before him. They didn't defy him or disobey him, and they didn't say a word against him. Paul tells us to obey the authorities. And that's hard because the authorities can be corrupt and evil. Paul knew that. In his day, the emperor was Nero, one of the most corrupt of all, and a man who cruelly persecuted Christians. We are to obey the authorities until a certain point is reached. Peter said what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also knew. We must obey God rather than men. Once again, you will need God's wisdom to know when you reach that point. The three friends were rewarded with promotion in the king's service, and that meant they were available to bring God's counsel to the king as he made his decisions, and he needed wise advice. Did you notice? He said that anyone who blasphemed against God would be killed and their homes destroyed. In many countries like Myanmar, people can be killed and their villages burnt because they are faithful to God. But this is just as bad. You cannot force people to believe or not believe, and no one should have to die for their religion, whatever it is. The three friends would be available to teach the king a better way. Use whatever influence God gives you for the good of all. And finally, when they were brought out of the fire, everyone gathered round and sniffed. There was no smell of burning on them. Better than that, Paul says that we are a fragrance of Christ. A beautiful smell is invisible and silent, but pervades a whole room. As I said earlier, if you are holy, you don't need to say or do anything. People will know. But only God can make you holy. And sometimes he achieves it through suffering. We don't know what happened to the three friends after this, so we don't need to know. God was with them in or out of the fire, just as he will be with you in times of trouble and of peace. I'm not sure whether I'll be making any more videos for you next year, but I am looking forward to being with you in person in December. So until then, bye for now.